Hello and welcome to Unstress. I'm Dr Ron Ehrlich. In this podcast, not surprisingly, we focus on stress and pillars of health. We hear so much about various diets, and paleo is certainly up there with one of the most popular, and I think with good reason. Autoimmune diseases are also a big issue, as you'll hear in this episode, actually even bigger than I thought, and I thought there were over 80 autoimmune diseases. Now that is the body attacking itself. And depending on your genetic predisposition, if your predisposition is your skin, your weakness, you might have psoriasis. If your gut is the weak link, you might have Crohn's or celiac. If thyroid, then you'll have an under or overactive thyroid, Hashimoto's or Graves' disease. Nerves, it could be Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis. If it's your joints, you might have rheumatic fever. Autoimmune diseases are big ones. The point is, while the manifestations of those diseases are very different, or appear to be different, the causes have some common overlap, some common themes, and that's all about gut permeability, or not all, but a great deal of it is about gut permeability or leaky gut, where undigested proteins enter the bloodstream and the body mounts an attack, an autoimmune response. It's an issue, as you'll hear, that is clearly on the rise. Now, another issue, inflammation, is another subject we touch on in this podcast, or rather chronic inflammation, which is a common denominator in almost every physical and mental degenerative disease, cancer, heart disease, even depression. You'll hear the word cytokines, and they are markers and the body's response to chronic inflammation. So they're mediators, if you like. Well, all that prefaces my guest today, Nora Gedgaudas. Now, Nora is a world-renowned nutritionist, neurofeedback practitioner, educator, author, and is in clinical practice in Portland, Oregon, in the US of A. She has an incredible in-depth knowledge of all things to do with nutrition and the intimate connection between our food, our immune system, and our mind and body. Now, I first got to know Nora in 2009 when I read her fabulous book, Primal Body, Primal Mind. Now, as soon as I read it, together with my friends Vicky and Tim Poulter, we have a group called Nourishing Australia. We brought Nora to Australia for a series of lectures, and it was a huge success, and it introduced many Australians to ancestral diets beyond just paleo. We call this episode Beyond Paleo because Nora's approach is unique. It's backed by some very solid science, lessons from the past, some very thorough testing and clinical observations, and some common sense. Her approach just makes so much sense. She is a wealth of knowledge. Nora also references Weston A. Price, who, if you didn't know, undertook what I consider to be one of the most important pieces of research ever undertaken. Even more relevant today than when he undertook it 80 years ago. Now, Price was a dentist, and what he was doing was looking for the cause of tooth decay. He visited traditional cultures living on traditional ancestral food. But what made it so unique was that at the same time he visited the same genetic groups who had just moved to nearby towns and cities and consumed a Western diet. So it was the perfect model to compare ancestral diet with Western diet. He not only found the cause of tooth decay, but he also found that all chronic degenerative diseases that accompany a society on a Western diet, consuming sugar and flour, in other words, a high carbohydrate diet. We talk about carbs, proteins, fats. We talk about leaky gut, mental and physical health. We talk about inflammation. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Nora Gedgaudas. Welcome to the show, Nora.
Oh, thank you, Ron. It is an honor and a privilege to be here with you.
Oh, well, it's lovely to talk to you again. It's been far too long. Now, listen, people have heard of this term paleo, and
Right.
And honestly, I just can't think of anybody better qualified to explain what that means, to define it, and outline why it is so important for, dare I say, total health and hopefully a longer and healthier life. Tell us about paleo.
Well, the term paleo has arrived at a lot of different meanings now. There are almost as many ways of defining it as there are people claiming to practice it. But, the basic idea behind it is that if we want to understand how to most optimally feed a human being, the most essential starting place is looking at the selective pressures that shaped our physiological makeup and our nutritional requirements in the first place. And by looking at what our ancestors did, what the kinds of foods that they would have most consistently had access to, that can lend us quite a number of clues as to what might be optimal for us now. Now, I actually take my own little twist on the subject, because just because our ancestors did something is not necessarily a good enough reason for me to want to do the same thing. Human beings have lived all kinds of places all over the world, eating all kinds of different things, although certain things fairly consistently. But just because they were able to put something into their mouths, chew it, swallow it, not drop dead, doesn't necessarily suggest to me persuasively that that was optimal for them, or that it's certainly going to be optimal for us now. So how would we know? And what I've done with that question is I've applied it to what we do understand in the realm of science, the science of human longevity research. Now, longevity research isn't simply about living forever. If you're living longer, it's usually because you're avoiding disease, right? So, and it turns out that there are some principles that dovetail rather neatly into that equation, and that you can use to extrapolate, what would be ideal and what wouldn't. Now, there are a variety of ways of going about making some of these determinations, and I use Weston Price as an example too, and we can touch upon that.
Yeah, no, favorite topic of mine.
Yeah. But with respect to the whole issue of longevity research, we do know, and I'll just throw it into a very quick nutshell, that they used to, for nearly a century now, research in everything from yeast to primates has shown conclusively that by restricting, they speak in terms of generalized caloric restriction, restricting calories seems to have the effect of significantly enhancing health and lifespan. And it seemed like a counterintuitive finding. Why would, being undernourished in some way or whatever be somehow beneficial? And what more recent researchers have uncovered in a couple of different arenas is that, number one, it turns out that insulin is a major issue in that regard. And it's not calories in general that are important. It's certain kinds of calories. And anything that evokes an insulin response is going to be compromising to us in some way. So the less insulin we require over the course of our lifetimes, the longer we're going to live and the healthier we're going to be by far. And of course, glucose, is inherently damaging to the body in multiple ways. We could spend a whole show just talking about that. And because there is no scientifically established human dietary requirement for carbohydrates, not in any medical textbook or textbook of human physiology anywhere, it's kind of a no-brainer. Leave that out. Sugar and starch, the utilizable carbohydrates.
But Nora, let me just stop you there, because I don't know that our listener is totally, you've said something that I think is really important, because the macronutrients, which are protein, fat and carbohydrate, there are minimum requirements of protein and fat, but you mentioned there aren't for carbohydrates. That's a really important point, isn't it?
Well, it is. And most people think that, vegetables are literally the most important thing you can consume. And the fact of the matter is we don't actually have an established requirement for them. Now, I am not saying that we should not be consuming them. In fact, I actually believe fibrous vegetables and greens are probably far more important to us today than they ever used to be during our sort of long evolutionary journey, because we now live in a uniquely challenging and toxic environment that it far exceeds the hostility of any that our ancestors faced. What we face as challenges today would be completely incomprehensible to our prehistoric ancestors. And it's interesting, too, that the threats that we are accustomed to facing, that we're psychologically wired for facing, are all pretty tangible. I mean, to a prehistoric ancestor, what did they have to worry about? Well, things like saber-toothed tigers and, cantankerous woolly mammoths and snakes and maybe big storms or volcanic eruptions or major climate changes and things like that, which are all quite tangible. For us, we have a false sense of complacency because we all live in climate-controlled environments that, with big screen TVs, and we don't have to take more than 2 steps in any direction to find something we might call food or food-like substances we can shove inside our mouths. But the threats that face us today are, by and large, not visible to us. For instance, the contaminants in our air, water, and food supplies, and GMOs, and all other types of biotech horrors, and EMF, electromagnetic frequency pollution, radiation contamination. All these kinds of things are challenging us in a way that has degraded our genome over the last few generations. And we've never been more vulnerable as a species than we are now, which has never lent a greater importance to making sure that our foundational needs are intact, that they're being met in a way that helps to keep those fundamental things, our fundamental health intact. With all of the toxicity in our environment, fibrous vegetables and greens can supply antioxidants and phytonutrients that have demonstrated, benefit toward helping us offset that toxicity. They help to bind excess hormones, and God knows we live in a sea of estrogen. So anything that is going to bind estrogen and help the body get rid of it is a good thing. It provides extra bulk that is, satisfying. And it also provides that badly needed fodder for our poor, embattled, and beleaguered microbiome, right? The healthy bacteria in our gut really does well when we add a greater variety of foods in the form of fiber to the mix. That's good too.
Now, this is why I love talking to you about paleo, because so many people associate paleo with, a huge protein hit on the barbecue. And you have just been talking about vegetables here, which is...
I've just been talking about vegetables, and I was talking about longevity.
Yeah.
The other aspect of that, because I mentioned insulin being, inimical to longevity. But the other discovery that was even more recent than that one involved the discovery of a metabolic pathway called mammalian target of rapamycin, and I promise I won't get too much more technical.
There's an abbreviation, isn't there? Let's use the
abbreviation. Yes, MTOR. What that is, it's basically your body's protein sensor, and it's involved with your reproductive mechanisms. And it's a way that your body scans to see, is there nutrient sufficiency in order to create new life right now? And when we consume protein in excess of what we need, it's an impetus for enhancing our reproductive capacity. So if you're looking to become pregnant, or you are pregnant, or lactating, or you're a baby, child, or teen, that makes sense. But if you aren't any of those things, and you're not, you're either past the reproductive age, not interested in reproducing right now, whatever, then what you're basically creating is an impetus for cellular proliferation, for making new cells. Now, when we live in an environment as toxic as the one we live in is, and we get these mutagenic influences, things that can affect our DNA and affect the health of the cell, and then you ask your body to start making lots of new cells, this is a potential impetus for cancer. But if instead you keep your protein intake to just below that threshold, which is about 21 grams of actual protein in a meal, okay, then you basically, I like to put it in modern day economic terms. It's like your body says, oh, apparently it's too expensive to build a new house right now, so let's fix up the one we've got. And instead, what gets activated is maintenance and repair mechanisms that take your existing cells and make them healthier. And the effect of that, the net effect, is of literally being anti-aging. I'm actually sort of abandoning the term paleo, and I'm abandoning terms like ketogenic because they become so heavily commercialized now as to almost become meaningless. And I call what I'm describing as primalgenic, right? It's just a term, kind of a catch term that encapsulates something that means something very specific that nobody else is going to take and run with and call anything else. So this involves a very low carbohydrate approach that is moderate in protein. This is not a high meat, high protein diet at all. It meets your protein needs from animal source foods, from complete protein sources, which I believe is important, and I can make the case for that in a minute. and then add as many fibrous vegetables and greens as you want to the mix. But you're getting the majority of your actual calories from actually fats, from a variety of healthy sources of uncompromising quality. And all of this food has to come from sources that are of uncompromising quality. In other words, organic, biodynamically grown, free range, 100% grass-fed and finished meats. That's absolutely critical to this equation because anything else is health compromising. I tend to be a bit uncompromising. So I figure if we shoot for the stars, we might hit the moon, right?
Yeah. No, that's actually, I mean, this episode we're calling Beyond Paleo because that's exactly, paleo has become this, and as you said, there are almost as many paleo diets, and it's become such a trendy thing that I really, now when did you write that book, Primal Body, Primal Mind? 2009, 2000?
Well, the original version of it, which was sort of self-published, and it had a lot of problems. But what was published in 2009.
Yeah.
And then I was approached by it's actually one of the largest independent publishers approached me and said, we would really like to take and run with this book, and that gave me an opportunity to completely retool it, rewrite it a bit, clean it up, and also add some new information and new research that came out immediately following the publication of the self-published version. So,
yeah, well, what I loved about it was that because paleo was emerging as this very trendy term, yours literally was beyond paleo, and here you are. You've been talking about the insulin levels, which actually, to be honest, Nora, are a recurring theme when we talk in this podcast. We've talked about cancer, insulin levels lower, heart disease, insulin levels lower, autoimmune disease, insulin. It's a recurring theme. And I loved and have always loved the way your focus is beyond paleo, and it makes so much sense. And it's this moderate amount of protein, which again, people construe paleo with high protein, and you've
they do.
Yeah.
I really, really try to distance myself from that way of thinking. Again, it's the basic paleo concept is, if our ancestors did it, it's good enough for me. And I've never seen it quite that way. I won't say never. I think early on when I discovered the concept, I'm like, well, of course, that makes perfect sense. And it does. I mean, to me, it's the only rational starting place. But it can't be an end point because we don't live in the world of our prehistoric ancestors anymore. And that's something else that I try to do is take the modern and rather challenging world that we live in today into account in that equation, which it seems that a lot of people within the paleo genre really don't spend a lot of time looking at in the way that they should. I also am not a big fan of dairy. Now, mind you, not all dairy is created equal. And if somebody has what I have to do first is qualify why I don't, because dairy also seems to be the darling, oddly enough, even though it's a post-agricultural thing. It seems to be the darling of both the paleo and ketogenic communities. So everybody's into grass-fed butter and raw cream and raw milk cheeses and things like that. And those are delicious foods, and they may be health-promoting. But the problem is that there's a phenomenon today known as autoimmunity. And I believe it is the greatest underappreciated health burden in the entire world. There are over 100 autoimmune diseases that have now been identified, and another 40 to 50 disease processes that are thought to have an autoimmune component. Dietary antigens are known to be a major impetus for initiating and exacerbating the progress of these diseases, as well as environmental contaminants and things like that, heavy metals, etc. And this has become a tremendous area of expertise for me because, well, frankly, I'm the only member of my family that doesn't have an autoimmune disease, and I'd like to keep it that way. And I also have a vested interest in helping those close to me, overcome many of their problems and symptoms. And I find that a lot of times where people have unexplained symptoms, that some manner of autoimmunity has to be ruled out. So dairy, the two most common dietary antigens responsible for initiating or exacerbating autoimmunity are in this particular order: gluten, in other words, from grains, and dairy. And half of everybody that has gluten immune reactivity has dairy protein as a cross-reactivity, meaning that some sensitive immune systems simply cannot tell the difference between the two and think they're the same, so that eating a piece of cheese might be equivalent to eating a piece of bread and all that that implies. You can be on a totally gluten-free diet, and yet you can be advancing your celiac disease by eating dairy if your particular immune system has those two things confused. And there's a lab called Cyrex Labs, which you don't yet have in Australia, but I know they're working like crazy on getting it there. That is the only lab in the world doing accurate testing in that regard that is able to really identify that.
Let me just stop, because here was a really important thing that I know I learned from you when we first met quite a few years ago, and that this is this concept of cross-reactivity. Because
Yes.
people get very enthusiastic, let's go off gluten, let's go off dairy, and many people do and get a positive response, but others don't.
Right.
And with an autoimmune condition, others don't and go, oh, well, it really wasn't a factor for me. But hang on, there's more.
Right.
Tell us about
Exactly.
cross-reactivity. You mentioned dairy and gluten, but it's far more complicated than that even.
Well, it's a bit more complicated. So the substances that have been identified thus far as being potentially cross-reactive with gluten include oats, including gluten-free oats, right? Corn, rice, which everybody thinks is hypoallergenic. It may not be at all. For some people, it's just as bad as eating a piece of bread. Millet is another thing. Yeast, like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, brewer's yeast or nutritional yeast is a potential problem, cross-reactive problem for some people, not for everybody. And dairy is far and away the most common, but dairy isn't just casein, right? There's alpha casein, there's beta casein, there's whey, there's milk butyrophylline, there's casomorphin. So there are a variety of proteins in dairy that have the potential to be immune reactive. And when I did my Cyrex testing, I would have predicted that dairy would be fine for me. At the time I tested for it, and this was after I wrote Primal Body, Primal Mind, so that book was a little bit forgiving of dairy. As long as it's like raw dairy and organic and from grass-fed animals and all that kind of thing. And I was just doing like raw grass-fed, organic grass-fed butter and heavy cream and goat milk cheese and sheep milk cheese and the occasional piece of cow cheese. And that was it, really, for me. I wasn't drinking milk or doing anything like that. And I was doing such high-quality stuff, I thought, how could it possibly be a problem? I was off the charts immune reactive to every single component of dairy that there was. And it was a profound cross-reactivity for me. And I'd already been gluten-free for quite some time, but I was still provoking the potential for initiating autoimmunity in myself and creating inflammation every single time I ate something that I cooked in butter or that I had a cup of tea with heavy cream in it. And that was a huge wake-up call for me because I feel like I'm pretty in tune with my body, but there's a clean windshield effect. When you've got it muddied with things that are causing inflammation, you sort of, that's your normal, right? That's what you kind of feel is the way things are. And, you seem to be above ground and be able to go to work, so it seems fine. But now that I've removed dairy from that whole thing, it's like a huge, huge difference.
Taking a step back here to autoimmune diseases in general, because you mentioned, 100, I've always said there are over 80, but we're up to 140 or 50 extras. This is actually the body attacking itself, and and the way it manifests itself is very much ruled by genetics, but the mechanism by which it's initiated is common, and I don't think a lot of people fully appreciate this. Can you why are these proteins such a problem? Why are these dairy proteins, these gluten proteins, these cross-reactivities, what's the connection? Why does the body start attacking itself?
Well, okay, so now, dietary antigens are certainly a potential impetus for triggering these things because, and gluten is the great, I call it the gateway food sensitivity. And this is an important, really, really important piece to this that everyone listening to this needs to understand. Now, again, number one, there's only one lab in the world doing accurate testing for gluten immune reactivity, and there are at least 9 proteomes of gluten potentially able to cause a profoundly inflammatory response. And there's only one, unfortunately, that nearly every lab tests for, and that's alpha-gliadin, and IgA immune reactivity to alpha-gliadin, because that's what's associated with celiac disease. And celiac disease is only 12% of what comprises the totality of what can be called gluten immune reactivity. And we know that the incidence of celiac disease alone has increased over 400% in the last 50 years alone. And why is this happening? So the other part to this that I need to point out is that you don't have to have an immune reactivity to gluten at all in order for it to compromise your gut and compromise your brain. Because every time you consume any amount of gluten, it triggers the release of an enzyme called zonulin, which I know sounds like something from a Star Trek movie, but zonulin basically is an enzyme that was discovered by Dr. Alessio Fasano from Harvard, and it controls gut permeability and blood-brain barrier permeability, both. The same mechanisms are controlled by both. So when you consume, say you eat a little piece of bread, the zonulin release causes your gut to suddenly become hyperpermeable. And if your digestion isn't pristine, which I know almost nobody's is anymore, you have any kind of undigested peptides or any foreign peptides that are able to get through that normally very selectively permeable gut lining. Sometimes I call it like the bouncer at the hip LA club who's deciding, who's cool and gets in and who's not and doesn't get in. Well, it's like gluten clubs that bouncer over the head, and he's laying there unconscious on the pavement, and all the geeks and the weirdos are getting into the club that don't belong there, and wrecking the atmosphere. And that's one of the things that gluten does, is it allows things to pass through the gut that the gut otherwise might not have allowed to get through, and then that gets into the superhighway called your bloodstream, and it also can get across all-important blood-brain barrier and influence and create an inflammatory response in your brain as well as throughout your body. And those inflammatory responses are a potential triggering mechanism for these autoimmune processes. So, foreign proteins and those foreign proteins incorporating into our tissues and whatever your inherent predisposition is. Hashimoto's, for instance, runs like crazy in my family. So that would be
Hashimoto's being underactive thyroid.
No, not necessarily underactive. It being autoimmune thyroid.
Autoimmune, okay.
And your thyroid may be underactive or overactive at different times. You'll have symptoms of both. That's one of the characteristics. Sometimes, you may feel, nervous and irritable and have trouble sleeping and all that kind of stuff. And there may be other times where you're really having trouble losing weight, or you're losing the outer third of your eyebrows, or you feel cold all the time and have an intolerance to that and all that kind of thing. The numbers are sort of all over the place because, your immune system is attacking your thyroid at various times. And when it does that and your thyroid starts to break down, well, what does the thyroid contain? It contains thyroid hormone. And so suddenly your body's flooded with these hormones, and that can be extremely agitating. In fact, psychiatrically, there are a lot of similarities in somebody having a full-blown cytokine storm. It's not necessarily dissimilar to somebody with bipolar, where they can be suddenly just, explosively reactive or extremely irritable. And then they may go to feeling depressed or anxious.
Well, this, of course, you call the book Primal Body, Primal Mind, and the connections between mind and body are profound. And you've actually just said the gut permeability and blood-brain barrier permeability. So it's not a stretch to think that what goes on in the gut, supposedly called now the second brain, affects the brain. But I wanted to move on to another topic that I know is, it's very popular. This is what this podcast is about. Stress. It's the topic of this podcast. And I know people are often told that their adrenal glands are overactive or even exhausted. And again, you've written another book about this. What are our adrenals telling us?
Right. So the thing to understand about the whole concept of adrenal fatigue or adrenal burnout is that it's not really true. There really is no such thing. That most of what natural medicine talks about in those terms is based on 1950s science that was never actually proven to be true. And, Hans Selye was the brilliant Canadian endocrinologist who way back when actually coined the term stress. He invented that term and he wrote the very first textbook on the subject of stress. And he had a theory that, adrenals, when exposed to progressive levels of stress, would become progressively unable to produce healthy amounts of cortisol in response to that stress. And eventually, your adrenals are in their various stages involved and whatever have you. And eventually, you just got two smoldering nuggets, that are poof gone, and now you're burned out and you can't deal. And it turns out that the science of stress physiology has basically disproven that theory many times over for a long time now. And it's unfortunate that that still seems to have a lot of traction in natural health circles. But the thing to understand about the adrenals is that all they are two little hormone factories sitting on top of your kidneys. And they do what they are told to do by your brain. So if your brain is dysfunctional, and I talk about 4 different areas of brain function in the book that may relate to adrenal-related issues, okay, may affect your adrenals' ability to function optimally, but it's not the adrenal gland's fault or issue. It really has to do with signaling mechanisms, right? The signaling mechanisms, the communication between the brain and the adrenals is dysregulated in some way, preventing the adrenals from doing their job. And more often than not, that is what is going on. Now, there is one other possibility, and I run into this too, a certain percentage of the time, maybe 10% of the time or so. That kind of brings us back to autoimmune again for a minute. But
No, it's all connected.
Yeah. I do a lot of Cyrex testing with clients, and I've seen hundreds of Cyrex reports. And I can tell you it is not that unusual to be producing 21-hydroxylase antibodies, which are associated with adrenal autoimmunity. But you are not likely to be diagnosed with what is called Addison's disease until the destruction to those tissues is nearly total. The medical standard of diagnosis is that, and this is a big problem, that you're not diagnosable with Addison's until at least 90% tissue destruction has occurred. So if you're only halfway there, 45%, I promise you will notice this in every part of the way you feel and function. You'll be spending fortunes on supplements and running to you're going to have counters and cupboards full of supplements, or you're going to have all kinds of prescriptions for things, and you'll have no answers because you're not diagnosable yet. There's, again, only one lab in the world doing accurate testing in a way that is able to catch these things in their earliest stages so that you can actually do something about it so that you don't end up getting the long-term diagnosis. There are all kinds of things you can do to modulate your immune system and manage these things extremely well so that you're completely symptom-free or mostly symptom-free, possibly even able to go into remission. But you have to know what you're dealing with first. So I don't want to belabor the autoimmune side to that because I don't think that is the majority of these cases. But it's something to bring in the mix as a consideration if you have chronically low cortisol levels that aren't responding to any of the other things that I talk about. So one of the things I do in Rethinking Fatigue is I outline, I talk about the different ways in which the adrenals become dysregulated, what are the brain-based mechanisms that do this, and then I provide a screening tool of sorts that allows you to kind of look at what are the symptoms associated with these different forms of adrenal dysfunction so that you can better identify which one is you.
And what are some examples of those symptoms?
Well, for instance, if you have, so there's a hypothalamic mechanism. That's a really common one. And there is a cluster of cells in the back of that called the paraventricular nuclear cells in the back of the hypothalamus that controls the amount of cortisol that your body is going to be releasing at any particular time. And so it regulates that in a more generalized way. And it turns out that certain types of cytokines can have a profoundly dampening effect on those paraventricular nuclear cells. So say, for instance, you get a flu bug or you get some kind of virus, right? And lots of people are walking around with chronic viral infections, lots of them. Cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr, Hep C is, a problem too. But there are all kinds of things out there. And your body generates interferon as a way of producing natural killer cells to go and attack the invading organisms. Well, it turns out that interferon, which is an inflammatory cytokine, has a profoundly dampening effect on the hypothalamus. And so your cortisol levels will be in the toilet if you have a chronic viral infection. And just as you would with a flu bug. How do you feel when you have the flu, right? You feel totally dragged down. And in fact, it turns out that the same type of mechanism, not always involving a virus, but certain forms of inflammation, seem to be at the heart of what actually is the root cause of most cases of clinical depression, chronic clinical depression. Depression is not an amino acid deficiency or a neurotransmitter deficiency per se. It is where all the research is going in that arena now, is looking at it as a cytokine model.
And cytokine is for our listener, is an inflammatory.
Yes.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah. So you feel dragged out, and, you feel like you can't get up and go, and you can't do anything and whatever else. Well, that is one particular mechanism. So there are going to be a certain set of symptoms obviously associated, with that. And for these various things, I basically provide people with, okay, if you think that this is you based on this profile, here are the tests that you need to take to look at that. And here are some of the effective ways of addressing that, if in fact that really is the problem, right? And so I provide an extremely practical step-by-step way of systematically figuring out what is actually going on with all that.
And I mean, people, you've just said their depression cytokine connection, people don't often associate mental health with chronic inflammation, do they? I mean, they just kind of...
No, they don't. People oftentimes don't necessarily associate mental health with physical health. I remember I had a neurofeedback client once. This was a person with the worst case of ADD I'd ever seen in my life. I mean, it was horrible. And I mean, she was missing appointments. She'd forget. Oh, gee, I forgot. She was just obsessed with, constantly distracted by her BlackBerry and, whatever. And this was somebody with lots of problems with anxiety and depression and couldn't sleep and, had all these problems and issues. And so I'm trying to train her brain, and we're not getting very far because she's got major hypoglycemic issues, and that was really apparent. It's like, what have you eaten today? Oh, I just had coffee this morning. I had a couple of Red Bulls around lunchtime, and then I had a pastry at 2:00 in the afternoon or something. And it's like, all right, girlfriend, you are in a world of hurt. At one point, I just said, look, we're not going to get anywhere until we start to address some foundational dietary issues, because I don't care what kind of therapeutic approach you've got and how effective it is. And I can be doing the best quality protocol in the world, neurofeedback protocol. It's not going to put a nutrient there that's not there. It's not going to take away some interfering substance that doesn't belong. And the brain and body need certain raw materials in order to function. And her body was just a mess. And she said, well, why would you think we'd have to talk about nutrition? She says, I'm perfectly healthy. She said, I get up and go to work. I don't remember the last time I was sick. I have a look at all the energy I've got. I'm like, you're confusing energy with neuroticism. You're confusing. They're not the same thing. Caffeine doesn't give you energy. Caffeine is a stimulant. And when you're hopped up on stimulants, you don't need to not confuse that with actual physical energy, right? They're not the same thing. And she said, yeah, but I'm healthy and I don't, whatever. And I held up her progress chart where she'd listed all of her problems. And I said, look at this. Last I looked, your head was screwed onto your body, right? These things are all an outgrowth. All that, for instance, emotions are just simply biochemical storms in your body and brain. And the healthier your underlying biochemistry, the better the forecast is likely to be, right? And so in her case, the forecast was always a mess. And she couldn't associate that with anything that she was eating because she didn't think physical health and mental health were related in any way, or cognitive function, were related in any way.
Yeah, look, that's actually quite a good point at which to go on to this subject of fats, because I think our relationship with fat is one of the major problems that we've faced over the last 30, 40 years. And can you share with our listener how you see fats and why, in fact, healthy fats are our friends?
Yes, well, they're more than just our friends. And I make the case in my newest book, Primal Fat Burner, which, by the way, is not inherently a weight loss book, although it will probably be everybody's favorite side effect from the material. But it's about adopting a metabolism that's based on burning fat instead of sugar as a primary source of fuel. But I also put forward a couple of, I think, fairly revolutionary hypotheses, but it's also extremely well supported by the evidence I supply. And that is that that dietary fat and fat-soluble nutrients, including and in fact especially those coming from animal source foods, are not only central to optimizing human health, but they are quite literally central to what made us human in the first place. And of course, the distinguishing characteristic that makes us the most human are our brains, our very large, abnormally large brains when it comes to anything else in the animal kingdom. And our brain size tripled from the time we were dragging our knuckles on the African savanna to about 20,000 years ago. Our brain size at least tripled in that amount of time, which is unprecedented in the biological world, in a whole of the animal kingdom. There's never been anything else like it. Now, our closest relative, of course, primate relative, everybody knows, is a chimpanzee. And they have a brain that is absolutely no bigger, somewhere between 250 and 500 cubic centimeters, depending on the species of chimp. And that hasn't changed in about 7 million years. Why is that? Because they haven't changed what they eat or how they do anything. They're still, swinging from vines and, and gnashing on those leaves and bananas. And their brain function is, they haven't made a lot of changes that have since occurred. And somewhere along the line, some intrepid ancestor, chimp-like ancestor, set foot on the African savanna, stood up on two legs, stood upright, and developed opposable thumbs that were able to wrap around something like a spear. And this was following a tremendous upheaval of climate change that occurred that created the impetus for certain primates to try something different. And they developed a taste for meat. Now, all great apes actually eat some meat. And chimps, there's a book by Craig Stanford called The Hunting Apes. He's a scholar and a primatologist and all that kind of thing. Anthropologist, and with the notable exception of certain herbivorous gorillas, who, by the way, have a brain only about a third of the size that would be expected for their size, certainly as compared to humans of similar size. What happened is that this primate ancestor, and Australopithecus afarensis is the first example that we have found of that, used stone tools, it turns out, 3.4 million years ago, to cleave meat and marrow from bones, and started to develop a more voracious appetite for meat and fat, and probably started out scavenging. But by 2 million years ago, when the first member of the genus Homo, which was Homo erectus, stepped out onto the savanna, by that point, we already had a full-time hunting economy. All right, our ancestors had a full-time hunting economy. And we developed the most unusually voracious appetite for fat of any other primate out there. And the smarter we became, and by the way, our brains are constructed from the very fats that we supply them with what it is that we choose to eat. And it's extremely interesting because the two fatty acids most responsible for our unique human cognition are these 20 and 22 carbon fatty acids, arachidonic acid and docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA, which are found exclusively within the diet in animal source foods. And chimpanzees, the primary fatty acids that characterize other great ape kind of cognition are omega-6 based. For us, it's omega-3 based.
But the other aspect, the evolutionary aspect of it is fascinating. But the other aspect of it is that we are being led to believe that we need glucose / carbohydrates to fuel our brains and our bodies. That's not necessarily true, is it?
No, it's not. It's a very misleading thing. It's only true if a person has cultivated a dependence on glucose as a primary source of fuel with what it is that they choose to eat. In other words, if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, your body's going to become adapted to relying on glucose as a primary source of fuel. I basically talk about carbohydrates in the context of being fundamentally metabolic kindling. We were never meant to rely on it as a full-time source of fuel. The so-called complex carbohydrates we're all told we need to be basing our diet on. Here in the United States, it's the United States Department of Agriculture that makes that recommendation, right? No conflict of interest there. your whole grains and your legumes and your brown rice and your sweet potatoes and things like that are all the equivalent of twigs thrown on your metabolic fire. Now, white rice, white potatoes, pasta, bread, crap like that are all basically the equivalent of having crumpled up paper thrown on that metabolic fire. And then sugary things, and sugary beverages, especially, and certain, sweet alcoholic beverages and things of that nature, can basically be viewed as lighter fluid or gasoline on that metabolic fire. Now, if you had a wood stove that you were using to heat your house with, although you in Australia may not identify with this analogy too well, but I'm from Minnesota, so that works well for me. You could certainly heat your house using nothing but kindling, but what would you be doing? The doors to that wood stove would be wide open, and you'd be constantly preoccupied with where the next handful of fuel was going to come from to keep that fire going. And God forbid you should get distracted and try to live your life, or heaven forbid, try to sleep through the night. And yes, there's an analogy here. And suddenly at 3 o'clock in the morning, you wake up and the house is freezing cold, and you go and you run and you look in the wood stove and the fire's going out. And oh my God, you're panicked. And now you're crumpling up paper and throwing that in there and using the lighter fluid to get the fire going again, because it ran out of kindling. But what's the alternative to this? Well, what if you were to take a nice big fat log and throw that on the fire instead? Now you're effectively free. That's going to burn long and slow and evenly. And you're going to be able to go about living your life, and you're not going to be preoccupied with where the next handful of fuel is coming from. Cravings for things tend to just kind of evaporate. You're satisfied for much longer periods of time. And fat is one of these fuels that you can draw upon for energy for your brain and for literally every organ and tissue in your body on an ongoing basis, even in the absence of regular meals. And I'm talking even for days and weeks, not just for a few hours. But the thing is that I can't think of a single multinational corporate interest that would not be heavily invested in every man, woman, and child on planet Earth eating a carbohydrate-based diet, because it's incredibly cheap and easy to produce. It's almost immeasurably profitable. I mean, there's no way you can make a 5,000% profit on a grass-fed steak like you can a box of cereal. And it keeps whoever is eating a diet like this more or less perpetually hungry. So, hey, fabulous for Monsanto and Kellogg's and Kraft and whatever else, and for Jenny Craig, but not so fabulous for you and me. I call it a form of metabolic enslavement. And we know now, just this last year, there was a huge expose in the New York Times that basically they uncovered evidence to prove that all of the finger pointing at dietary fat as the culprits in heart disease and diabetes and all kinds of, basically whatever ails us, and obesity, all of it was basically based on influence by the sugar industry. They were paying off researchers left and right to conceal the evidence that was emerging, that actually it was the increased consumption of dietary sugars and carbohydrates in the diet that were in fact leading to the obesity and heart disease epidemic. And they instead turned the tables and decided to blame dietary fat for this. And that has been disproven now so many times over that it's absurd. But if you speak a lie enough times and loudly enough, it becomes, like a self-evident fact, even when there's no evidence to support it, no real evidence that wasn't ghostwritten or where that wasn't adversely influenced by some industry.
That message is a recurring theme on this podcast and certainly in my book too. Listen, we've covered so much territory here. I want to just finish by asking...
up.
You're just warmed up. I know. But listen, I wanted to ask you this one last question. What do you think, and this taking a step back from this whole issue in general, what do you think the greatest challenges that people face in our modern world on their health journey through life? What do you think it is?
I think immune dysregulation has to be, obviously metabolic dysregulation is a huge problem, but, also immune dysregulation. And that's being triggered by so many things. And it's one of those things that, again, is less visible. It's not necessarily outwardly visible, although if somebody's suffering chronic systemic inflammation, they might look a bit puffier and it may be harder to lose weight and all that kind of a thing, for sure. Sometimes it's one of those primary impetuses for resistant weight loss. But, certainly metabolic diseases are on the rise, and cancer is expected to increase more than 70% over the next 20 years. And I think that number is quite low, actually. I think that's lowballing it. Things like autoimmunity, cancer, and other types of, for instance, infectious diseases and things like that, our immune systems are extremely compromised.
Yeah.
And, dietary antigens are a major impetus for those kinds of compromises, as are environmental antigens, all kinds of chemicals and heavy metals and things like that can also lead to further compromise. I'd say it's a combination of both metabolic and immune-related problems.
Great. Nora, always fabulous talking with you. We're going to have links to your website. I know you're doing a Primal restoration program. We'll have links to that and those three fabulous...
Yeah, it's a 52-week educational program that's accredited.
Yeah, no, we'll have links to all of that on our website. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's an honor and a pleasure as always, Ron. It's always great talking to you.
Nora's books are so well written. We'll have links to them in the show notes. The titles themselves tell a story. As I mentioned, Primal Body, Primal Mind, the subtitle being Beyond Paleo for Total Health and a Longer Life. Then she went on to write Rethinking Fatigue, What Your Adrenals Are Telling You and What You Can Do About It. And more recently, she wrote Primal Fat Burner. Now here's the byline: Live longer, slow aging, superpower your brain, save your life with a high-fat, low-carb diet. Now that may have been quite a mouthful, excuse the pun, but certainly a worthy goal, I'm sure you'll agree. Now, don't forget to do some great reviews on iTunes. Now, interesting aside here, we invite a lot of people, and I have to say almost everyone accepts my invitation, which is just lovely. I love talking to our guests. But last week, a very high-profile person in the wellness field replied that regrettably they could only accept requests from shows that attracted over 100,000 listeners per week. I said, okay, we're not there yet, but I'll give you a call in a few months' time. So do leave some reviews on iTunes. We want to get up to that number if we can. So until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak